Hey everyone, Russ with the Reg team. It's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker. Aaron Sparling is an officer with the Portland Police Bureau in Portland, Oregon, where he serves in the investigations branch of the Forensic Evidence Division's Digital Forensics Unit. Aaron's talk today is titled, When Your Memory Forensics Tools Only Tell Half the Story. At the end of the talk, there'll be a live Q&A with Aaron. Just click the link that will be displayed at the end of the talk and you'll be taken to the Q&A channel. So without any further delay, here's Aaron.
Welcome to the presentation, When Your Forensic Tool Only Tells Part of the Story, Finding Code Injection with Memory Analysis. I guess before diving into my presentation, I should introduce myself. My name is Aaron Sparling. I'm an officer with the Portland Police Bureau. I've been with Portland for almost 16 years now. For the last 8.5, I've been doing digital forensics. And during that time, I've been fortunate enough to have been assigned to a couple different task forces, to include the FBI Cybercrimes Task Force and the United States Secret Service Electronics Crimes Task Force. I currently am the chairman of the Technical Advisory Council for the United States Secret Service's National Computer Forensic Institute, the NCFI in Hoover, Alabama. I have a couple certifications, and most importantly, I'm not a spelling bee champion. So if you see a grammatical error or a spelling error, let me know and I'll change my slides. So, what's the end game for this presentation? Well, luckily, we're only going to have a few PowerPoint slides to go through, and during that time, we're going to loosely define, for the purpose of this presentation, code injection. We're going to talk about some of the tools used for doing the analysis of code injection, more specifically memory analysis. But really, the bulk of this presentation is going to be in demo land, where I'm going to walk through 3 memory samples, illustrating some small workflows. 2 of those samples are going to be pretty easy wins. It's where we're going to walk through a methodology where the tools are telling us everything that we'd expect them to tell us. And the third memory image is really the thesis of this whole presentation. It's here where the tool is going to be pointing us in a direction, but it's not going to be giving us a complete story. And it's going to require us, the analyst, to dig a little deeper to get to those artifacts and that evidence of code injection that we need in order to move forward with our investigation. So let's loosely define code injection. So for the purpose of the presentation, I'm just going to say it's the act of injecting code, and in this case malicious code, into the memory address of a targeted process, and then executing that code within the context of the injected process. Now I know there are numerous types of code injection techniques out there. I've listed probably the 3 that I think are the most recognized and that maybe you guys might be the most familiar with. And that's DLL injection or remote DLL injection, reflective DLL injection, which is sometimes leveraged by shellcode loading a malicious DLL, and hollow process injection or process hollowing. So what does a code injection recipe look like? And again, this is a very generic recipe. I know there's more complex ones out there. And I've also gone ahead inside the squiggly brackets and added some common Windows native libraries and APIs that malicious code will leverage for creating recipes for code injection. So the first thing the malicious code needs to do is obtain a list of the active running processes on the system. It wants to see what's running so it can figure out what it wants to pick on or inject itself into. And in this case, we're just going to pick on notepad.exe for this example as we walk through the recipe. So we've isolated notepad.exe. The next thing we want to do is open a handle to notepad.exe and then suspend that process, suspend notepad.exe, so that we can then allocate some of its memory and change the permissions, something like page execute read write. This will allow us to then write or move our malicious code into that newly allocated memory range, be able to execute and write code within that memory range, and then resume a thread or or re-execute the program. And like I said, malicious code or malware authors will leverage native Windows APIs. These are not malicious on their own, but they can be used for malicious intent if they're used in the right fashion within the malware or within the code. So the tools that I'm going to use for the analysis. The bulk of, or the entire demo is going to be done inside of a virtual machine. And in this case, I'll be utilizing the Rimnex virtual machine, the latest version, which is version 7. If you're not familiar with Rimnex, Rimnex is a virtual machine that is developed and maintained by Lenny Zelster, who is the course author and course lead for the SANS Forensic 610 Reverse Engineering Malware course. And this is a VM that he and his team keep frequently updated. They have all kinds of tools installed in it for doing static and dynamic and code level analysis in regards to malware and malicious documents, as well as memory analysis, code analysis, and then some file system level forensics as well. It's freely available for anyone to download and use. The tool I'll be using for memory analysis will be the volatility framework. In this case, I'll be using volatility 3. I do recognize that it is limited in terms of its plugin support because it's still in beta, but for the purpose of this presentation, there's plenty of plugins that will work just fine. For code analysis, I'll be using RADAIR2 or R2, and then for code deobfuscation, I'll be using CyberChef. So with that, it looks like it's time to just jump right into demo land. So moving over to my Rimnex virtual machine, you can see that I've got the first memory image loaded up here, and I'll walk through my syntax. So for those of you that have never used volatility before, I'm going to show you real quick what my command line syntax is. So the vol3 is calling the volatility framework. The -f is pointing it at my memory image, which is this front1.lime. I'm saying render it in the pretty mode, and then I'm saying run the ps list plugin and take that output, pipe it to grep, and search for the presence of SVC host or service host and explore. And you can see we get some output. On the left, we get the process ID, the parent process ID, the name of the process, address and memory. We get threads and handles, the session ID column here, and then we get some heuristics for whether or not it is a 64 or 32-bit process. Now, this memory image comes from a 64-bit system. Everything that's flagged false means that it's saying that these are 64-bit processes. If it's flagged true, it means it's a 32-bit process running on a 64-bit system. So as we scroll through here, we see we have 2 explorers, which in and of itself is not malicious or suspicious per se, until we get over here to the sessions column, and we see that both of these explorers have a session ID of 1. And you'll also notice that this last explorer is also a 32-bit process running on a 64-bit system. So one of these should have a session ID of 2. The other thing you'll notice with process ID or PID 4224 and 4268, these service hosts, they're both 32-bit service hosts running on a 64-bit system, but more importantly, their parent is this 2096, where if we were to look what 676 is for the rest of these service hosts, we would see that 676 is services, which is the proper parent-to-child relationship. So immediately, we have a starting point, a pivot point. Let me clear my screen, and I'll show you what I've done. I've pre-cooked a couple directories, and what I decided to do was we're just going to go ahead and pivot on PID 4224, which is one of our suspicious service hosts. So I went ahead and dumped the entire memory range, virtual memory range of PID 4224 using the memmap plugin and dumping it to this directory. And then I used the floss tool, and I ran the floss tool against this dump file and outputted that to a text file so that we could more granularly search through this text file, through all the strings that were created from this dump file. And for those of you that aren't familiar with floss, floss is a strings utility tool that has some deobfuscation abilities built into it that is freely available and designed and developed and maintained by the folks from the Flare team from Mandiant FireEye. So now that we have a strings document that we can search through, let's do that. And the first thing I'm going to do, which might seem a little counterintuitive, is I'm going to run the strings command with a -n1000 against my text document, because what I want to do first is I'm looking for large sections of data that might resemble something of interest. So scrolling to the top of my output, I immediately see a reference to a web inject 32, which quickly piques my interest, which is followed by a section of data which looks like it might be base 64 encoding. Looking below that, I see a VNC64 and again a big section of data that might be base 64 encoded, but we're not sure. So we now have this web inject that we can pivot on as we search through our strings document. So let's do that. So grepping for web inject, we see the reference to the web inject 32, and then we see that section of data that I highlighted before that might be base 64 encoded. We don't know, but I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to copy that to my clipboard for now because we're going to come back to that. But looking through here, we also see reference to a new string, which might be a domain. We see this HTTPS, this timnosa, and this web inject underscore new.dat. So now by grepping for web inject, we also have found reference to a domain, and we're also able to copy and potentially isolate this section of data. So before we pivot on this domain name, let's go ahead and take the data that we copied that might be base 64, and let's see if in fact it is base 64. So I've placed it in a CyberChef, and using the from base 64 as my decoder, I've decoded the output, and we see the presence of what might be an MZ header or a PE file. We see something that resembles a DOS stub, where this program can't be run in DOS mode. Reference to PE, we don't know if that's just by chance or if that's actually portable and executable. But as we start to look a little bit further, it looks like legitimate headers or sections within a PE header, right? So like the read-only data, the data section, the text section, and the relocation section. And immediately below that, we see a bunch of just what is possibly data. So one of the unique things about CyberChef is we can actually dump this out to a data file for analysis. And I've already done that for you guys, so pre-cooked. So I'm just going to clear this out, and we're going to come back to that in a little bit. So before we take a look at that dump file, we're going to take a look at the timnosa domain and see what we might discover by grepping for that. And again, this is a fairly robust output, but it's not incredibly big. And so scrolling back up to the top, and we start to move through it, you'll notice there's this interesting string.exe. And if we come down a little bit farther, we can see that that is referenced with that domain. So instantly, this piques my interest, and I want to pivot or look and see, does this particular string.exe, does it exist anywhere within my memory image? And one of the ways I can do that is I can leverage Yara within the volatility framework. And I've gone ahead and pre-cooked this because it takes about 4 minutes for this particular plugin to run, but I'll walk you through my syntax. So I've run volatility 3 again, render in the pretty mode, and in this case I'm saying run the vad Yara scan plugin with the -- Yara - rules, and then give it the string, this long string.exe as our rule. And like I said, 3.5, 4 minutes later, it's done scanning the entire memory image, and it will give you the virtual offset of where the rule match was found, its corresponding PID, in this case 42224. You also notice that we found it in 42268. Both of those are the suspicious SVC hosts that we saw in our PS list output. But now we see 3 other new processes, 3884, 4564, and 5100. Well, we don't know what those are, but we can quickly find out. So I clear out my screen, I up arrow, and we're going to go back to the PS list plugin, and we're going to say -- PID, and we're going to say 5100, 4564, and 3884, I believe. And so this is saying just search for the presence of these 3 processes. It finds 3884, which happens to be the parent process of 4564 and 5100, and all 3 are Chrome. Okay, well, that's interesting. So let's um, let's pivot on one of these. And so we're going to go ahead and just pivot on 5100. And what we're going to do is we're going to come back up to 5100 here and just grab this virtual offset because I want to know what was going on with this particular process in regards to that long string.exe. What within memory within this process was surrounding that? And this will make more sense here in a second. And I'll walk you through what my syntax was. So I've jumped into Volshell, and for those of you that are familiar with Volatility 2.6, Volshell is a plugin within the Volatility framework, where now in Volatility 3, it's kind of its own standalone framework. So you'd run Volshell, point it at the memory image, -w says, hey, interpret this as a Windows memory image, and drop me into the current context of PID 5100. And we can see that we are. So what I want to do next is I want to display the bytes at the offset where that Yara rule match was. And I'm going to say, show me the bytes starting at that offset for the next 256 bytes. And we see here's that exe, the string. We see a URL to a web inject 32. We see the reference to our Timnosa domain. So real quickly, we were able to see, identify a whole nother process, this Chrome process, and pivot on it. The next thing that we're going to want to do, because we're talking about code injection, is take a look at PID 5100, but we're going to utilize the malfind plugin. And I'm going to say run malfind against PID 5100, but I want to grep for the presence of an MZ header. And I'm saying, show me one line before and 7 lines after any matches. And you can see here within Chrome, process ID 5100, at this offset in memory, this virtual offset in memory, is the start. This is the range. We have a VAD short, a virtual address descriptor, that is flagged page execute read write. So this has page execute read write permissions, and then it also has the magic value of what might be a portable executable file sitting at this memory address. So that's immediately interesting to me. So I'm going to copy this memory address right here because we want to validate this. And one of the ways that we can do that is by using the VAD info plugin. So we can use the VAD info plugin, PID 5100, and then we'll just grep for the presence of that memory address and see what VAD info has to say. So VAD info ran it against 5100 at this memory address, or 540,000. It too shows that it's flagged for page execute read write. So now we have two plugins within the volatility framework showing us that a particular range within process 5100 has a VAD set for page execute read write. Well, now we're going to want to take a closer look at what is going on at this address at 5400. Because again, remember, we're talking about looking and validating code injection. So we're going to drop back into Volshell, and we're going to drop back into PID 5100. And we're going to say, let's display the bytes at this address, but show me 1024. And when we do that, we see that MZ header that we were talking about. But now again, we start to see reference to the DOS stub again. This program cannot be run in DOS mode. And then we also see reference to PE again, and we see sections, or what we reasonably believe to be the headers for sections of a PE header, or sections of a PE header. So we see the text section, the read-only data section, the data section, relocation section. So it's easy for us now to notice that it looks like we have what looks like to be a portable executable sitting in the memory address range of chrome.exe at this offset. Now, if you remember, we dumped our file from CyberChef. So if you remember, I've got a CyberChef directory here where we dumped that web inject that we decoded from base 64 and dumped it to a bin file. Well, one of the things that we can do is we could just run the file command against it and see what the file command says. And it recognizes it as a 32-bit executable, a DLL. Okay, well, let's run one other tool against it. And in this case, we'll run the objdump tool with the -x command or condition. And we're seeing it's executable, 32-bit, it's a DLL. So the other thing that I look at is the compile time. And I can tell you that for this investigation, this compile time was actually quite important. But for this demo, I'm really just interested in confirming that it's 32-bit and that it's a DLL. So let me just recap what we did. We ran the PS list plugin. We grepped for the presence of service host and explorer. We found 2 service hosts and 1 explorer that were 32-bit and also had a few other conditions that were a little suspicious. We pivoted on PID 4224, which was service hosts, dumped its entire memory address range for that particular process, ran floss against it, created a text file, and started grepping. Located a reference to a web inject, grepped the web inject, pulled out some code, that a section of data that looked like it might be base 64 encoded, decoded that with CyberChef, had the presence of what looked like a portable executable file. Within CyberChef, we were able to dump the decoded section to a data file. We then went back to grepping through our strings file, and we pivoted on the domain name of Timnosa that we found, and that's where we found that interesting string.exe. When we scanned Yara for that, we found 3 new processes, which all were Explorer. One of those was 5100. We pivoted on 5100, and utilizing and leveraging malfind, it showed that there was the presence of an MZ header as well as a VAD range at the 540,000 that was flagged page execute read write. We then pivot on that into VolShell, took a look at what was going on, and we found what looked like a portable executable file sitting within the memory address range or the memory range of chrome.exe. So that was pretty quick. Quick way to identify code injection. Our tools did everything that we thought it would do, and it showed us everything that we thought we were going to see. So let's move on to a second memory image. And here I've gone ahead and just ran volatility 3 against our grayskull image, rendered it in the pretty mode, and just jumped straight to malfind and said, look for the presence of an MZ header. And in this case, it wasn't able to find it. So it scanned the entire memory range, looking for the presence of an MZ header against all the processes, and it didn't find it. So we also know that sometimes with reflective DLL injection, shellcode might be used. And one of the things that shellcode utilizes is a no-op sled or a NOP sled, not always, but in some cases. So now we're just going to run the malfind plugin, and I'm just going to grep for the presence of a no-op. And one of the things we have to be careful is sometimes we'll get false positives because that's just a hex value of 90. So it's possible it's going to come across a hex value of 90. But as this malfind plugin's running, it's scanning the entire memory range, looking for any VADs that are flagged page execute read write, as well as a few other things that have to do with map path to disk. But then I'm also passing it to grep and saying, look for the presence of a no-op. And let's see what it's able to find. And we can see here that we get a return for 2 no-ops found. But what's interesting is it sits at this memory address, but if you'll notice, the second no-op immediately follows it. So this might be indicative of a no-op sled. So that is, or a NOP sled. So that's pretty interesting to me. Well, last time, in the last memory image, we picked on service hosts, or we pivot on service host 4224. Let's see what happens if we grep for Explorer. So remember in the first memory image, when we ran the first plugin, which was pslist, I went ahead and grepped for the presence of SVC host and Explorer. We found both, but we pivoted on Explorer or on service host. In this memory image, we're just going to grep for Explorer and see what if that gets us anywhere. And again, Malfind's got to scan the entire memory image and then pipe it to grep and look for this condition, which is Explorer. So it generally takes like 20 seconds. It's not incredibly slow. And this is running in a virtual machine too. So here, Malfind has found 6824, PID 6824, which is an explorer.exe at this memory address. And this is the range, but this is the start of this memory address. It's a VAD short, and it's flagged page, execute, read, write. But if you'll notice, this memory address happens to be the exact same memory address where we found the presence of this no-op or this hex 90. So now, this is incredibly interesting. So let's take this memory address and let's pivot on it. So like before, we used vol shell, so let's stick with it. And we're going to do -w because it's a Windows, --PID, and our PID is 6824. So again, we're going to drop into the current context of PID 6824 within vol shell. And we are going to display bytes again, and we're going to set it at that offset, and we're going to give it a count of, I don't know, 256. And again, here is that hex 9090, and we see some output here in the ASCII, but we're not really sure, is this shellcode, is this not shellcode? One of the things that we can do is we can just up arrow, and we can change the display bytes to the disassemble capabilities within vol shell, and we can do a little bit of disassembly and see if this looks like legitimate assembly code. And we see the no ops stacked on top of each other, immediately followed by a jump. And we start to see references to registers, 64-bit registers. And so we start to see stuff that reasonably looks like a legitimate assembly code. Well, the next step would be to take a closer look at this section. And we can exit out of vol shell. We're going to make a directory, and we're going to call it malfind. And now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to dump that section, and I'll walk you through my syntax. So what I've done here is I'm running volatility again, but I'm saying output the dump to my malfind directory that we've created, and I'm saying run malfind against PID 6824, and then giving it the dump command. And so it's going to go through, it's going to do that, give us the output, which we see here. Here's our copies of the no-op. I'll clear out my screen. We'll do a quick little sanity check into our malfind, and here is that section where we think we might have potentially shellcode. Well, we can do a quick little code level analysis before we pass this off to a reverser, or maybe you are your own reverser. And so one of the ways that we can look at that is with R2 or radair2. So I'm going to type in my commands, and then I'll walk you through what it's doing. So what I've done is I've called R2. I'm saying this is a Intel x86 processor. It's 64-bit. I'm saying disassemble it in the quiet mode and then print that disassembly to standard out. So what you can see here is we've seen just a little bit more detail than what VolShell was able to show us. So, again, we see what looks like the presence of a no-op sled immediately followed by a jump of a keyword to some location in memory. Then we start to see registers being moved around. We see the RAX register being pushed onto the stack. So this looks like legitimate code. And now that we've dumped this, we could pass this on to one of our reverse engineers and they could try to emulate this or reverse it and see what is going on with this particular piece of code. So again, I'll recap what I did was we went ahead and jumped straight to the malfind plugin and we grepped for the presence of an MZ header and we didn't find one. So we said, hey, let's go ahead and grep for a no-op. And when we grep for a no-op, we found the presence of a no-op at this memory address range, and we saw two no-ops stacked right on top of each other. That was of interest. Well, because in the previous one, we pivoted it on at service host, I decided let's just pivot on Explorer. So we ran malfind a third time, but this time we said let's grep for Explorer. And when we did, malfind found that Explorer had a VAD at this exact same address that was flagged page execute read write. We found that to be incredibly interesting. So we decided to validate that with the VAD info plugin, and we ran the VAD info plugin just against PID 6824, grepping for that memory address. And yes, we found that it was indeed flagged page execute read write. So we dropped into VolShell, and when we dropped into VolShell, we said, hey, display the bytes at this memory address, the memory address where we found the presence of the no-op, and show us the next 256 bytes. We saw some output that may or may not resemble shellcode. So since we weren't sure, we decided to use the disassembly command within VolShell to disassemble those 256 bytes. And we saw something that looked pretty much like assembly. So we exited out of VolShell. We created a directory called malfind. We ran the malfind plugin one more time, but this time we ran it against PID 6824, and we dumped it. Those sections that the two memory sections that malfind identified into our dump directory. And then at the end, we leveraged raderror R2 against our dump section so that we could do a little bit deeper code level analysis and see if we were going down a rabbit hole or if our tool was reporting what we think it should be reporting. So let's move to our third memory example, and I'll kick this one off. And this is going to be the one where it's going to point us in some directions, but it's going to make us work for it. And so, again, we ran volatility 3. This is against our pizza.line memory image, and we jumped right into the malfind plugin because, again, we're talking about code injection. And I'm saying grep for the presence of an MZ or a no-op, because in the first memory image, we had great luck by searching for MZ headers. The second memory image, we had a lot of luck by looking for a no-op. Well, we find no presence of an MZ header, and we see plenty of no-ops, but they don't appear to be like a no-op sled where they're stacked right on top of each other. So these could just be false positives where we just have hex 90s somewhere in our output. So remember before we grepped for service host and Explorer, so we'll do SVC host and Explorer. And let's see if malfind flags either a service host or an Explorer or Explorer.exe as having any VADs that are flagged for page execute read write. And we'll notice that there's 1, 2, 3 service hosts and 1 Explorer that malfind has found to have VADs that are flagged page execute read write. So I'll clear my screen out. We'll go ahead and we will up arrow. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, hey, I want to see a little more detail about what's going on. Show me the 8 lines after you hit on these service hosts and Explorer within malfind. So we can see here's, PID 164 service host.exe at this address in memory. That VAD starts and it's flagged page execute read write. We can see a little bit of output. It's not overly concerning. Skip down another service host, this 1232. No output, but it is flagged page execute read write. Again, we go through, we see a little bit of output, a little bit of output. And this is where I was like, well, this is super interesting. And so one of the things that I've realized over time is that the absence of data can be as telling or more telling than the data itself. So if we go back to PID 1232, this service host, we can see that there's no data here at all. There's nothing. But the VAD is flagged page execute read write. So that to me was a little interesting. So I immediately pivoted on this. So we're going to grab this memory range and we're going to copy it, and I'll clear my screen out. And just like before, we're going to drop into VolShell. And we're going to drop into the current context of process PID 1232. And I'm assuming you're starting to see a little bit of a pattern in our methodology here. And so we're going to, instead of displaying the bytes, we're going to disassemble at this memory address. And we'll do a count of, I don't know, we'll do 1024. We'll start with 1024. And as you notice with the output, there appears to be no data. So I'll clear my screen so you can see. I'll up arrow, and we can change this 1024 to, I don't know, 2048. So we'll just double it. And again, no data. So I'll clear my screen again, and let's just say, hey, let's do 4096, which is an entire frame in memory. And see what this gets us. Well, that's interesting. So here we're seeing nothing. And this is where I was like, what is going on? And I realized and I remembered that there's malware out there that will sometimes wipe the first physical frame of memories, and in some cases it'll overwrite the actual header of the PE file that it's of the executable that it's injected into memory, or it can, as you notice, there's a range of memory that's been allocated that's flagged page execute read write. It's possible that they could have just skipped this first page and then started the code injection in the following page in memory. And that's what I kind of was thinking was happening. So I was like, well, let's just grab this last memory address range here at the bottom. I'll clear my screen out, and let's start there. And so pasting this in, and we'll just do a count of 1024. Aha! Here you will notice that we start to see what looks like some legitimate code. That's of interest. So if we would have looked a little bit more in this, and I've pre-cooked it for the sake of this demo, but I can tell you if you would have done a little bit further investigation within VolShell, you would have been able to find that at this memory address, and I'll put it in here, we find the presence of an MZ header. So this is within that new region that we were looking at. We can see again the DOS stub, and if we wanted to change this to 1024, you get a little bit more robust output, and we start to see, references to, again, the PE header, so reference sections within the PE header. So we know we're on the right track. So we're going to quit out of this, and I'll clear my screen so you can see, and we're going to make a directory, and we're going to call it malfind. And just like in the previous example, we're going to dump the section. So we're going to dump PID 1234 - dump, but before we say enter, we have to tell it where we want it to dump to. And with volatility 3, you have to put the dump directory before the plugin. So we're saying, hey, run malfind against PID 1232 dump the sections that are flagged page execute read write, and send them to our malfind directory. In this case, it's only one section. We'll do a quick little sanity check to see if it dumped it, and it did. Okay, well, let's take a look and see if we can't recover that injected file within this memory range. So one of the ways that we can do that is we can open up this dump section within a hex editor, and we can use the search feature for 4D5A, which is our MZ header, and we can see that it finds it right here. Close this out so you can see. Here's our 4D5A MZ up here. Again, we see this program cannot be run in DOS mode, and then we start to see sections of the PE header. So because we're inside of a hex editor, we can go ahead and try to carve this out. And one of the ways that we can do that is just basically highlighting all of the bytes above the start of our MZ header, right-clicking, saying delete, and then we're going to save as, and we're going to call it 1232.bin, and close out of our hex editor. And if we look in our current directory, we should now have a 1232.bin. And one of the things that we can do is we can just run the file command against that. And the file command is showing this to be a portable executable, 32 bits, and looking, it shows it as a DLL. And like before, we can run objdump -x against our 1232.bin. A little more robust than our last output, but we'll scroll back up to the top and we see, in fact, it's 32-bit, it's a DLL, it's an executable, and a compile time that's, almost 10 years old. Well, we still don't know what we're dealing with, so we can run clamscan, because it's baked into Remnix, against our bin file that we carved out. And for those of you that aren't familiar with clamscan, it's basically just an AV scanner with a bunch of other things that you can do with it, but we're essentially just running AV against our 1232.bin file that we just carved out of memory. And pretty quickly, we get a reference for a hit to the Morto virus. And so we could come back to a web browser and put in Morto virus. And we'll see here a couple write-ups. And if we open up one of them, like this one here from F-Secure Labs, we can scroll through this analysis and we see some references to some embedded passwords within the binary. We also see references to run dll32.exe run as admin, and then also that this particular malware scans for the presence of AV. So let's take a close look at this and see if in fact this is, what we're dealing with. And so we'll run the floss tool against our carved out binary, pump it out to less so that we can scroll through it. And as we scroll down through this output, we start to see references to run dll32.exe, run as admin, okay. And then we also see what looks like passwords, or could reasonably be passwords, right? Well, the word password, and then as you scroll through here, you see some pretty commonly used passwords. And then as we continue down through this output, we're going to start to see references to some API calls, but then also we'll start to see references to different AV engines. Like here is references to some of the different AV engines, so it's AV aware. So we can, and then also you'll see a reference to run dll32.exe. We still see a reference to SVC host. So there's a lot of good stuff in this output that, like here's the reference to SVC host, that corroborates that, hey, yes, we've more than likely just carved out a mortovirus sample. So let me recap what we did on this third memory image. We used volatility. We jumped straight to the Malfind plugin. We said, hey, in the first two examples, we had a lot of success in example one by looking and searching for the presence of an MZ header. In the second one, we had a lot of success looking for the presence of a no-op. Let's look for both of those at once. Nothing was found. We got some no-ops, but they look like false positives because they weren't stacked on top of each other in memory. So then we said, hey, let's just run malfind again and grep for Explorer and service host. It flagged on both SVC host and Explorer as having VADs that were flagged as page execute read write. However, we need a little more information, so we ran it again and said show us 8 bytes after the hit so that we could get a little bit of the output. And we noticed with PID1232, which was a service host.exe, that there was no data being displayed. So in order for us to investigate that a little bit further, we opened up VolShell, we dropped into the current context of PID1232, and we started disassembling at the address where malfind was starting at the address that malfind was flagging, and we weren't seeing anything. So we got through the first frame, we decided to jump into the second frame, and that's when we started to see what looked like legitimate assembly code. Because I pre-cooked the offset, we displayed a section within that second frame that showed the presence of an MZ header. So we dropped out of malfind, made a dump directory called malfind, ran malfind again, this time dumping those sections, or in this case, a single section that was a single VAD arranged that was flagged, and put that into a hex editor, search for the presence of the 4D5A, which would be the start of the PE file, and carve that out with the hex editor, dumped it, or saved it as a bin file, and then we ran a couple quick ran the file command and objdump against it to see what it was being reported as, and it was coming back as a 32-bit DLL. And then we ran clam scan against it, and we got a positive hit for the mortovirus. Did a quick little OSINT lookup on our web browser to get a couple indicators of what this virus might entail. And then we ran the floss tool against the binary that we carved out of memory that we called 1232.bin. And then we searched through the output and we saw matches within the strings output that matched the indicators within the write-up. So you can see how with this particular memory image, and again, I said this is kind of like the thesis of this whole talk, malfind is saying, hey, there's something weird about PID1232, but I don't have any data to show you. And so if you were new, if you were, say, new to doing memory analysis and you haven't spent a lot of time doing this analysis, and especially weren't super familiar with maybe the malfind plugin, it would be easy to just skip over this 1232 because there's nothing here. And most folks, they're usually looking for like the presence of an MZ header. And so again, it's the tool's telling us there's something going on here. There's something going on with PID1232. But this is all it's going to show us. And so again, it was the absence of data in this case that was more telling than this just random data. And so we were able to pivot on that. And that's where knowing how your tool works, knowing how to investigate these processes a little bit deeper within your tool will actually help solve or answer some of these questions when the tool or the plugin is only getting you so far. So that is it for the demos. Let me jump back over to my slide deck. Here are some of the references to the tools that I used, as well as some other webinars and books and stuff out there that you might want to access. And then I will be available for questions. I really appreciate you taking the time to watch this presentation, and thank you very much.